So today we're studying the 1889 Principles, part number 7, Chains of Prophecy. And when we talk about a chain, we think about individual links. And all the individual links go in together to make a chain up. And anytime you break a link, you break, obviously, the chain. But each link is important, and each link adds to the length and to the continuity of the chain. In mathematics, we have a lot of different kinds of problems, and we saw them using different methods, algorithms, formulas, etc. But as one wise mathematician said one day, every problem is actually a mathematical problem of arithmetic. Every problem can be solved with arithmetic. You say, well, how do you multiply? 6 times 5 is 30. That's not addition. Yes, it is. It's adding 6 5 times, or adding 5 6 times. If you're subtracting, you're simply adding negative numbers. Division is simply a reverse of multiplication, or a quick subtraction, actually. And even when you go into your algebra and calculuses and things like this, it all is based fundamentally on addition. One little link of the mathematical of the mathematical process actually ends up producing the whole chain of everything else. We're going to be talking about the principles of prophecy in considering prophecy as links that all to go together to show us a total whole of God's picture for us. And just to read the statement, if we'll go to the next slide now, it says that the world's history from specified dates in the past, the rise and fall of empires, and chronological succession of events down to the setting up of God's everlasting kingdom are outlined in numerous great chains of prophecy, and that these prophecies are now all fulfilled except the closing scenes. And we're going to be looking at this statement, but this is a kind of statement that's going to be a little more difficult for us within our time frame to take our Bible and line upon line, precept upon precept, here a little, there a little, to be able to substantiate, because what we would have to do is we would have to have several studies on different chains of prophecy. For instance, we'd have to have a study on Daniel 2, a study on Daniel 7, a study on Daniel 8 and 9, Daniel 11 and 12, Revelation 12, Revelation 13 and 14, etc., to actually substantiate it. So I'm going to have to depend to a degree on this for your prior Bible knowledge. However, I'm going to list a lot of references. I'm going to give you a lot of texts, and these will be in the keynote or the PDF if you want to download it from smyrna.org. And so you can get these, and they will be available, and I'll make them available to anyone who wants them. Okay, and so you can have these. Okay, but let's just go to slide number 3, the next slide. And we see here a little image of Daniel 2, the man from Daniel 2. We see the beast of Daniel 7. And in our specific statement, it spoke about specified dates in the past, the rise and fall of empires. And indeed, as Adventist biblical students, we have compared history with Bible prophecy. And we've been able to see, for instance, the rise and the fall of the kingdom of Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar and then later his son and grandson. And we have specific dates. We generally date that from around 605 to 539 BC. We have then the rise of the Medo-Persian Empire. And we have, again, specific dates for Persia from 538 to 331 when at the Battle of Arbela, Alexander the Great won a decisive victory. The Grecian Empire and then the Roman Empire from 165 BC down to AD 476, where you have the breakup of the Roman Empire. And so we have here, within the prophecies, we have rise and fall of empires, specified dates given. It speaks about chronological succession, going to the next slide. It speaks about chronological succession of events down to the setting up of God's everlasting kingdom. And these are outlined in numerous great chains of prophecy. And so it's not just one prophecy or chain of prophecy. They believed that there were numerous, and I listed off 6 or 7 earlier, and that all these chains are actually giving us a panoramic view of similar events, and we're going to see how they differ here in just a little bit. But the statement also says, and going to the next slide, that these prophecies are now all fulfilled except the closing scenes. And if you remember last week, when we were talking about number 6, the place of the study of prophecy in the Bible Students Library, that we discussed different modes of interpreting prophecies. We talked about preterism. We talked about futurism. We talked about the apostelligmatic principle. We spoke about the spiritual scheme of interpretation, but most importantly, the historical or the historist scheme of understanding. That is the scheme or the way to understand the Bible that Adventists have used. It was the way that the Protestants used to interpret the Bible, to say, we think that the Pope is Antichrist and the papacy is the beast power. Okay? And so what we have here in the historic scheme is it makes a place for these chains of prophecy. That's why Adventists have believed in this concept of chains of prophecy, because they accepted the historist view. And friends, if we let go of the historist view, if we accept something else in its place, we are going to really fundamentally change the way that we view so much in the Bible. Now let's go to the next slide. And here we ask the question, so what did the Adventist pioneers say about this concept of chains of prophecy? Why did they what were their reasons? Why did they understand this? How did they interpret it? And so I want to spend a little time today looking back at some historical statements so that we have an understanding of what these people believed. And not only what they believed, but sort of why they believed it. You know, what was their basis for doing this? So if we go to the next slide, the first statement we have here is a statement by Daniel T. Bordeaux, one of the Bordeaux brothers. And this is from a book, Sanctification or Holy Living, page 13 in paragraph 1. But it says, it would not be necessary to enter into a lengthy argument to convince the candidate that we are living in the last days. By comparing the sure word of prophecy with history and the signs of the times, we see clearly that we are occupying the last link in those great chains of prophecy which were to reach to the end. So he speaks here, he uses this term, great chains of prophecy, and he says we're living in the last link. Now if we go to the next slide, this statement continues and says that the leading signs which were to be the precursors of Christ's second coming and which were to bring us to the last generation have been fulfilled, and that the present signs of the times show conclusively that the great drama of this world's history is about to wind up, and that the Lord is near, even at the doors. And then we continue. But now let's go to the next slide. And here we have a statement from Uriah Smith in his book, Daniel and Revelation. This is the 1897 edition, page 5 in paragraph 1. And Uriah Smith writes, in no portion of the Word of God is this more apparent than in the books of Daniel and the Revelation. For no other parts of that Word deal so largely in prophecies that pertain to the closing scenes of this world's history. No other books contain so many chains of prophecy reaching down to the end. So here Smith is speaking about chains of prophecy, and he says specifically Daniel and Revelation, they have these chains of prophecy. You really don't find these same kinds of chains of prophecy in Ezekiel or Hosea or other books. Continuing in the next slide, in no other books is the grand procession of events that leads us through to the termination of probationary time and ushers us into the realities of the eternal state so fully and minutely set forth. No other books embrace so completely, as it were, in one grand sweep, all the truths that concern the last generation of the inhabitants of the earth, and set forth so comprehensively all the aspects of the times, physical, moral, and political, in which the triumphs of earthly woe and wickedness shall end, and the eternal reign of righteousness begin. He continues in the next slide. We take pleasure in calling attention especially to these features of the books of Daniel and the Revelation, which seem heretofore to have been too generally overlooked or misinterpreted. So Uriah Smith is encouraging the people to study Daniel and Revelation. That's why he wrote books on it. He wrote 2 books, Thoughts on Daniel and then Thoughts on Revelation, Critical Thoughts on Daniel and Critical Thoughts on Revelation. Later they were combined into a single volume. And he says that these 2 books, above all, speak about chains of prophecy. Now if we go to the next slide, we have here now a statement from J.H. Waggoner. He was the father of E.J. Waggoner of 1888 fame. And this is from a work he did called A Refutation of the Doctrine called The Age to Come, on page 23 in paragraph 1. And he says, closely connected with the great prophetic outlines or chains of prophecy, we find many explicit statements of the determination of the Lord concerning the people and the nations of the earth. Now notice here that Elder Waggoner, he speaks about the chains of prophecy, and he compares it, or he sets it up in parallel to the concept of great prophetic outlines. Here's an outline of a prophecy, another outline of a prophecy. These are chains of prophecy. This was the phraseology with which they used. Continuing in that book on page 161 in paragraph 1, Waggoner states, the book of Revelation consists of several lines or chains of prophecy, reaching to the same point, to wit, the coming of Christ. By considering the relation of the various links of the chains to that event, we may easily discover the parallels in each. And so as you see the different events transpiring, you'll be able to see the parallels in the different chains, he's saying. And then continuing in that same paragraph, he says, the vision of the sounding of the trumpets reaches to the coming of Christ. Chapters 11, 15 through 19. Chapter 14 reaches to the same time and embraces the same events revealed in chapters 11, verses 15 through 18. Chapter 11, verses 15 through 18. James White, in the next slide, in his famous book, Bible Adventism, on page 73, writes the following. The book of Daniel contains chains of prophecy, which reach down to the end of earthly kingdoms and the judgment. Chapters 11 and 12 are one chain, reaching down to the time when Michael shall stand up, the time of trouble such as never was, and the resurrection of many. Chapter 12, 1 and 2. And so Elder White, again, he was understanding this concept of chains of prophecy. He spoke about Daniel 11 and 12 as being a chain. We know that Daniel 2 is a chain. We know Daniel 7 is a chain. Daniel 8 and 9 combined is a chain. And he says Daniel 11 and 12 also are a chain of prophecy. Going to our next slide, again in Bible Adventism, 73. In verse 6, one says to the man clothed in linen, which was upon the waters of the river, how long shall it be to the end of these wonders? The end of the wonders is the close of these scenes connected with the judgment. In the next verse, the answer is given by the man clothed in linen with a most solemn oath, with both hands raised to heaven. Continuing the next slide. But, says Daniel, I heard, but I understood not. Then said I, O my Lord, what shall be the end of these things? Verse 8. The prophet here makes earnest inquiries relative to the scenes connected with the second advent. And so these scenes are depicted in chains of prophecy, links, which are individual events or sections that are delineated in the prophecies and explained on further. Continuing the next slide. It says, read the angel's reply. Go thy way, Daniel, for the words are closed up and sealed till the time of the end. Verse 9. The prophecy of Daniel, which points distinctly to the period of the second advent, was closed up and sealed till the end of time. And then in the next slide, again from Life Incidences now, page 47, he says, it is characteristic of the different chains of prophecy that each succeeding one introduces particulars not furnished in any previously given. The seventh of Daniel, after covering the general field symbolized by the image of chapter 2, instructs us more particularly concerning the development of the little horn or man of sin. So we just pause there for a minute. We think about Daniel chapter 2. It's a very basic, rudimentary outline. You have Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, Rome. Not a lot of detail about them. But in Daniel chapter 7, you get more detail. You understand, for instance, that Medo-Persia has certain characteristics that are not laid out in Daniel 2. Greece has certain characteristics not laid out in Daniel 2. As Elder White says, especially you have this little horn power introduced in Daniel 7, and that is further elaborated upon in Daniel chapter 8. And so as you have these chains of prophecy, the next one fills in and gives more detail to make so we know things are sure. Continuing in the next slide, Elder White says, in the 8th chapter, we are again conducted over a portion of the world's great highway with additional particulars concerning the mighty kingdoms that stand as waymarks along our journey. And of course, this is, you can understand now why we sang the song that we sang to open our service. You know, look for the waymarks, those great prophetic waymarks. They're so important to us. Going to the next slide, Elder White is speaking here from a little booklet called Signs of the Times on page 24, paragraph 2. This is not the journal Signs of the Times, but a little booklet that was produced. And he says, while the book of Daniel has to do with 4 universal monarchies, Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome, and its several chains of prophecy bring us with wonderful definiteness to the day of God, the second coming of Christ, and the last judgment. The book of Revelation pertains to the 4th, Rome, and its several lines of prophecy bring us down with equal minuteness to the same point and open before us the naked glare of eternal scenes. So this was an understanding that Elder James White had. Now, looking at a little bit more in the next slide, we have some more statements from Uriah Smith. And I know we're getting some history here, and this history is important because we have nothing to fear for the future except we shall forget the way the Lord has led us and his teachings in our past history, right? So we have to see how the Lord has led us too. And here, writing in an Advent Review and Sabbath Herald article of December 11th, 1856, and notice the date, it's early in the movement. The pioneers understood early in the movement that the prophecies, especially of Daniel and Revelation, had to be understood and interpreted through a historicist scheme of interpretation, and that they formed great chains of prophecy. Here Uriah Smith wrote, the great object of the book of Revelation seems to be to show the Christian traveler his whereabouts on the highway of time. This is faithfully done by the many chains of prophecy in that book, which span the period of the 4th universal empire. Continuing, he says, thus we have line upon line, that the highway may be definitely marked, each link in these prophetic chains answering as a waymark. So Uriah Smith, he's saying that in the book of Daniel, you may have these chains that go back to Assyria, Medo-Persia, Greece, Rome. But in Revelation, mostly it goes forward from the 4th kingdom with Rome. The next slide, we have some statements here from J.N. Loughborough from just the next year in the Advent Review and Sabbath Herald of March 19, 1857. And Loughborough wrote, now admitting that the book given by the Father to the Son was the book of the future, and that those events contained in that book were kept secret till the book was opened, the next question would be, where and when began the breaking off of those seals? And of course, he's referring to chapter 4, where the Son comes before the throne where the Father sits, and then the Father gives him the book that's sealed with 7 seals. And that's what book he's talking about here. And continuing the next slide, he says, you will probably answer, where John had the vision recorded in chapter 6. But if that was the case, the events of the first seal were still closed up after they commenced to have been fulfilled. He continues in the next slide. The events of the first seal are applied by most commentators as having their commencement with the commencement of the gospel church, when that church went forth in power, their mission being attained by signs, divers miracles, and gifts of the Holy Ghost, and they, as represented by the rider on the white horse, went forth conquering and to conquer. And then continuing, but what happened at the time of the giving of this vision that should prevail with the Father to then and there open the book? That which prevailed with the Father and gave power to open the book was that the Lion of the tribe of Judah, Christ, appeared in the midst of the 4 beasts and 24 elders as a lamb slain. Continuing, we will admit that John had a view of the opening of the first seal as well as the others. And Loughborough continues, The events of that seal were then transpiring and were among the things that are, which we understand John was commanded to write. I understand that John's mind was carried back to the commencement of this chain of events as his mind was carried back in other chains of prophecy for the purpose of shedding light on the prophecy and to give the commencement of those events. It does not necessarily follow, because John had a vision of the opening of those seals, that none of them were opened till he had had a view of their opening. Continuing. Daniel had a view in chapter 7 of the lion with the other three beasts coming up out of the sea. But we do not conclude from the fact that Daniel had a view of the coming up of the lion that Babylon did not rise till Daniel had that vision. But we understand that his attention was carried back to the rise of that kingdom in order that the student of prophecy may have the whole chain before his mind. Loughborough continues. So we understand in the testimony concerning the seven seals, John's attention was carried back to the first link in the chain of consecutive events in order that the chain may be complete. And the reason I'm going through so much with what Loughborough wrote here is because it helps us to understand how he was going to interpret the chain of the seals and why he would do that. And now going on to another statement from Uriah Smith we have here. And this is from the Advent Review and Sabbath Herald of March 26, 1857. He says, from the considerations thus far offered, it is evident that this government, referring to the United States of America, in both of its leading principles, republicanism and Protestantism, is false to its profession. It is a lamb only in appearance. How wonderfully has this nation thus far answered to the symbol, and what feelings should it create in our bosoms as point after point we trace it out and perceive the wonderful harmony. Thus, another link is added to the great chains of prophecy that are leading us down to the end. Another great waymark is set up to show us our position in the world's history. Another great evidence that we are right in our calculations of the approaching consummation. And, he says, that our hopes and anticipations of a glorious and immediate deliverance of all the faithful are well founded. Now, I'm just going to go back and review a point or two here. Uriah Smith is speaking here about our nation, and he's speaking about the nation that's prophesied there in Revelation chapter 13, you see. And so he's speaking about this section as being a great chain of prophecy and how our nation answers that. And because of this, we can calculate and know where we're at on our map of time. I'm up here near the great white hills of New Hampshire, right? Not to be confused with the Green Mountains of Vermont, right? But the White Mountains of New Hampshire. But part of what we call the Appalachian Trail goes through Vermont, New Hampshire, into Maine. And as you go on this great trail that actually starts down in Georgia and goes all the way through the Appalachian Mountains up into Maine, you have waymarks, you have trail markers the whole way through. About every 100 feet or 150 feet, you'll see a little white blaze that's been painted on a tree or a rock or something so that you know which way the trail is going. Sometimes you can tell by the path, but sometimes the path isn't easy to see in some places, especially if you're scrambling over rocks or something. And in our experience, we need waymarks. We need points to help us to know where we're at in the stream of time so that we might know our correct place and our purpose and what God wants us to do at these very times. I'm going to go down to the next slide that shows a picture of D.M. Canwright. Some of us heard of Canwright. Canwright was someone that was quite high in the church for a long time, but then later apostatized. But in the Advent Review and Sabbath Herald of April 26 of 1864, he also spoke about chains of prophecy. He says, behold, we have numerous chains of prophecy locating the second advent, all terminating within a few years of the present time. And he lists several verses you can check out. And so again, they understood these chains of prophecy, that they basically would terminate with the coming of Christ. A little more current, in the next slide, we have Irwin Henry Evans, or I.H. Evans, in the General Conference Bulletin of October 1901, page 579. He stated, Revelation comes and goes as quickly and as surely as the rest. Where are we in these great chains of prophecy? Down in the close of chapters 13 and 14, just between verses 13 and 14 of chapter 6. And so he understood that there were chains of prophecy. They helped us to understand where we were at. Now, I mentioned last week that if you were to compare the 1872 or the 1889 statements of fundamental belief, those first statements of fundamental beliefs by the Adventist pioneers, all those fundamental statements that they had published up until the year 1931 concluded or had statements on prophecy. There was a statement number 6 on the place of prophecy, the need to study prophecy, and statement number 7 that dealt with chains of prophecy. So it doesn't seem unusual to us to read from these pioneers and even from Elder Evans here about chains of prophecy. But you won't read about chains of prophecy in Adventism today, not in the modern works, because these statements have been deleted from the fundamental principles. They're not there anymore. We do not have any statements on prophecy anymore. We have no statement on the man of sin anymore, identifying who the man of sin is. You could be a Seventh-day Adventist in good and regular standing, and you don't have to believe that the Pope is Antichrist. You don't have to believe that the Church of Rome is the beast of Revelation 13 or the little horn of Daniel 7. You don't have to believe that and be an Adventist in good and regular standing. You can believe it anything you want because we have nothing specific on that in our fundamentals anymore. But friends, these chains, as we look at the next slide, we just see, again, a picture here of these, some of these chains of prophecy depicted in graphic form. But friends, we do have a truth about this little horn power. We have a truth that understands that these things go back and to as far as Babylon, and they accumulate with the coming of Christ and his kingdom. And we need to understand that. Now, I want to go to the next slide. In fact, the next 2 slides, we're going to just summarize some of the points that were given, and as we understand this by our pioneers. The first point, chains of prophecy link history from specific points to the judgment and the coming of Christ. And that's important that we understand specific points. There are people such as Desmond Ford who use the apostolic principle and they try to apply these principles to multiple interpretations. And it's just hard to try to even put specific times and events for some of those multiple interpretations to ever possibly come into event and to happen. But if we will stay with the historical understanding of prophecy, that it's an unrolling scroll, it is a chain of link after link after link that brings us from specified times to the coming of Christ, then these prophecies make so much more sense. They're so much easier to interpret. They all come out in harmony with each other. You know, instead of interpreting one line of prophecy one way and another line of prophecy a different way, and then trying to find a harmony between the two of them, you just can't do that when you use different methods of interpretation. The second point that we summarize, the biblical chains of prophecy help us to know where we are in the end of the times, and we certainly should know that now. The next point, Daniel and Revelation contain many chains of prophecy, but we also see chains in Matthew 24, 2 Thessalonians 2, and other places. Those are just some points. Now, the next slide shows us 3 more points. And again, these are primarily points that we gathered from seeing what the pioneers had written. Each succeeding chain of prophecy introduces particulars not furnished in any previously given. The chains of prophecy and revelation begin with the 4th kingdom of the chains of Daniel, Rome in both pagan and papal phases. And sometimes these chains reveal events in the past, like Loughborough was speaking about their events in the past. So again, looking at our graphic here in the next slide, again, we have these specific kingdoms, we have succession, we have more additional information given from one to another. Now, in our next slide, we just have a few notes about the chain of prophecy of Daniel chapter 2. The beginning of this prophecy is with the kingdom of Nebuchadnezzar. You can read about that in Daniel 2, 31 through 37. The ending is in Daniel chapter 2, verses 44 and 45, where Christ's kingdom is being set up. Now, we have several of these chains we just want to review today, and that's all we have time for is today. But I have added, if you will just start scrolling, or I will scroll down for you, but I've added these main verses for you so that if you wish to download these slides, you have those verses available. Obviously, the best is always to go to your own Bible, make sure I didn't miscopy something or get something wrong. But you will have at least these outline points that you can look at in an easy study format. But if we go to the slide now that says Chain of Prophecy, Daniel 7. Here it says the beginning is with the kingdom of Babylon. Again, it starts in the same time that the Chain of Prophecy in Daniel chapter 2 does. And the ending is Daniel chapter 7, verses 9 through 14 and 26 and 27, where the saints take the kingdom. If you remember in Daniel 7, you have this long section where the prophecy is delineated, and then you have an interpretation of it. And that's why you have the ending in both two places in Daniel 7. And so I've given you those verses. For instance, the next slide shows Daniel 7:4. There it says, the first was like a lion and had eagle's wings. I beheld till the wings thereof were plucked up, and it was lifted up from the earth, and made stand upon the feet as a man, and a man's heart was given unto it. And we know this is speaking about the kingdom of Nebuchadnezzar. And then we have Daniel 7, verses 9 and 10, where it speaks about the judgment and the Ancient of Days. And Daniel 7, verses 11 and 12 after that. And so what I'm doing, I'm just giving you these verses so they show you the outlines of where these events happen. But now I'm going to proceed until I come to the slide that says Chain of Prophecy, Daniel 8 and 9. And again, here we have the beginning with the kingdom of Medo-Persia, Daniel 8 and verse 20, and the ending is found in Daniel 8, 13 and 14, and 17 and 19 with the judgment. Now, some people wonder if we go to the next slide, why does Daniel 8 not include Babylon? By the time that Daniel received the vision of Daniel chapter 8, Babylon had passed off the scene. Medo-Persia was now in control. There wasn't a need to speak about Babylon at that time in the same way. But here you have the prophecy now of the two-horned goat and then the single-horned he-goat that tramples upon the ram. In Daniel chapter 8 and verse 3, in the next slide, he begins this. He says, he lifted up my eyes and saw, and behold, there stood before the river a ram which had two horns, and the two horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher came up last. Here we're learning something. We're learning something that we don't learn about in Daniel chapter 2. We're learning about something that is spoken of in Daniel chapter 7. Remember in Daniel chapter 7, the second kingdom, the Medo-Persian Empire, is spoken of there as a bear, and raised itself up on one side higher. And we have that same situation here, a little more detail. And this helps us to understand the rise of the Medes and the Persians. You know, the Medes were the first of the two, but the Persians became the predominant part of that kingdom alliance. In the next slide, Daniel chapter 8 and verse 20, we have an interpretation. Friends, we have an interpretation from an angel in heaven. The ram which thou sawest having two horns are the kings of Media and Persia. They are not the kingdoms of modern day Iraq and Iran. They are not the kingdoms of Russia and Egypt or somewhere else. I cannot emphasize this enough. We have an interpretation from heaven. It need not change. It need not change. And then in Daniel 8, verses 13 and 14, we have now the judgment, the 2300 days introduced. And going to the next slide, in Daniel 8:17, we have here where Daniel is told that, for at the time of the end shall the vision be, giving a framework again that this is a chain of prophecy that continues until the end of time. And then in Daniel 8:19, again, and he said, behold, I will make thee know what shall be in the last end of the indignation, for at the time appointed the end shall be. And then if we continue, we have a chain of prophecy in Daniel 11 and 12. And this begins with the kingdom of Xerxes in Daniel 11:2, and the ending is in Daniel 12:1 and 8 through 10, where Michael stands up, and you have the end of events happening there. And so we have those verses listed for you again in the next three slides. And again, those are for your reference. If we take time to read and try to expound on all these today, it will take quite a long time. I hope and pray that you will do that, though, and that you will study these chains of prophecy. If you've never went through these prophetic chains, you should do that. It's important to read these prophecies and understand them. Going on to the next slide that says chain of prophecy for Revelation 2 and 3 and the churches. Here again, we have another chain of prophecy. And it says the beginning is with the church of Ephesus, Revelation 2:1, and ends with the church of Laodicea, Revelation 3:14. We have those two verses listed in the next two slides. We have Revelation 2:1 unto the angel of the church at Ephesus write, and then, of course, in Revelation 3:14, it speaks about the church of the Laodiceans. Now, there's a statement I'd like to share with you, and this is from a statement that Ellen White wrote in Manuscript Releases, Volume 1, page 372. And she says this: the names of the churches are symbolic of the Christian church in different periods of the Christian era. The number of the churches, 7, indicates completeness and is symbolic of the fact that the messages extend to the end of time and are enforced today. Now, let me just pause here. I don't know if you caught that last part, but it says that the messages extend to the end of time and are enforced today. So there's messages in all those churches that we need to be listening to and understanding. She goes on and she says, while the figures used are symbolic of the state of God's professed people, the wheat developing among the tares, truth stands on its own eternal basis in contrast with error. Again, that's Manuscript Release, Volume 1, page 372. So you might want to take that into account as you're studying through the churches. Going to the next slide, we now have chain of prophecy, Revelation 5 and 6, and this is what we commonly call the seals. Now, from Manuscript Release, Volume 9, page 7.1, he says, and Ellen White is quoting, first of all, Revelation 5, 1 through 3, and then she'll comment on here in the next slide. And I saw in the right hand of him that sat on the throne a book written wherein, and on the backside sealed with 7 seals. And I saw a strong angel proclaiming with a loud voice, who is worthy to open the book, and to loose the seals thereof? And no man in heaven, nor in earth, neither under the earth, was able to open the book, neither to look thereon. And then continuing to the comment. There, in his open hand, lay the book, the roll of the history of God's providences, the prophetic history of nations and the church. Herein was contained the divine utterances, his authority, his commandments, his laws, the whole symbolic counsel of the eternal, and the history of all ruling powers in the nations. In symbolic language was contained in that roll the influence of every nation, tongue, and people from the beginning of Earth's history to its close. Now here we have something that may deviate a little from the norm, because we said that the norm seemed to be that the chains of prophecy and revelation begin with the fourth kingdom. But here we are told that in the seals, in this chain of prophecy, it begins with the beginning of Earth's history and to its close. So think about that. Think about that. Continuing to the next slide, we have the chain of prophecy of Revelation 8 through 11. We call this the trumpets. It begins in Revelation 8:7. We've historically interpreted that to be the invasion of the Roman Empire by the Visigoths. And it ends in Revelation 10:7 through 11 and 11:15, again with the judgment and the coming of Christ. And we have those verses, Revelation 8:7, 10:7 and 8, Revelation 10:9 through 11, and Revelation 11:15 given there. And we might just pause there at Revelation 10:9 through 11 at that slide, because this slide really means something to us, or the verses on this slide. The verses on this slide should really mean something to us. And I'll just briefly read this and comment upon it. But John says, I went unto the angel and said unto him, give me the little book. And he said unto me, take it and eat it up, and it shall make thy belly bitter, and it shall be in thy mouth sweet as honey. Now, we know that this book is the book of Daniel. It's the book of Daniel. And specifically, concerning these chains of prophecies, that they understood that the 2300 days were going to terminate in 1844, and they thought it was the coming of Christ, and it's such a sweet thing in their mouth, in their spiritual mouth, that Jesus would come in their lifetime. But then it became very bitter because of the disappointment when he didn't come. And he says, and I took the little book out of the angel's hand and ate it up, and it was in my mouth sweet as honey, and as soon as I had eaten it, my belly was bitter. And he said unto me, thou must prophesy again before many peoples and nations and tongues and kings. And Revelation 11:15 now in the next slide. And the seventh angel sounded, and there were great voices in heaven saying, the kingdoms of this world are become the kingdoms of our Lord and of his Christ, and he shall reign forever and ever. In the next slide, we have the chain of prophecy of Revelation 12. And this is the prophecy of the great controversy. It begins in the beginning of Revelation 12, the first two verses, with the incarnation of Christ. and then it ends in Revelation 12, verses 16 through 17, and I have those verses listed as well. Continuing on till we come to the slide that says Chain of Prophecy, Revelation 13 and 14. Here you have the Antichrist prophesied, you have the beast, the image of the beast, you have the mark of the beast crisis. Begins in Revelation 13 with the rise of the papacy, the identification of the papacy. As we compare the beast of Revelation 13, we know it's a composite beast. It's a leopard-like beast, but it has the mouth of the lion. It has the feet of the bear. And this is linking us back clearly to Daniel 7, to that chain of prophecy. And this prophecy ends in Revelation 14, verses 17 through 20. And we have those slides that are there available for you that can be downloaded at smyrna.org if you'd like to have those slides. But what can we really learn from this, and what is the great point that we can gain from this today? I think it's this, friends. Number one, that we can know where we're at in the frame of time. We know that we are here at the very edge of the sounding of the seventh trumpet. We are at the edge of the sixth seal, going into the seventh seal. We are down in those feet of iron and clay, in Daniel 2. We are at these great prophetic waymarks right now, and God wants us to understand that we have a duty. And there are other prophecies besides these chains of prophecies. There's other prophecies that help us to understand where we're at in the stream of time. And prophecy must be a part of our study and work. And let me just see if I can. I'll stop sharing that for right now, and I can come back to my camera for just a minute, because I want to speak to you personally, and I want to appeal to you that this is the time that God has given us to come together as a people and to finish the work. I read a statement, I believe it was Wednesday night. This is another study I did. It wasn't for our church. But it stated to the effect that God's not going to finish the work without human agency. God will not finish the work without human agency. And if there was ever a time that we as God's people needed to be coming together, it's right now. It's right now. And we have a truly historic opportunity to come together as God's people as we're working to reorganize the movement and the mission. And I had a call. I should tell you about a call I had this week. And it was a very interesting call. And someone had called because they said, I wanted to talk to you about your reorganizational effort, because I think there's something you need to know before you get any further in this. And I thought, well, this person's going to tell me, that there is a church, we're to stay with the church, the ship is going through, don't leave or anything like that. But what they actually were wanting to tell me was that this reorganization has already occurred, and we need to join it. And I said, well, what are you talking about? And they said, well, it's the shepherd's rod. It's the movement of the shepherd's rod. That's where the truth is. I don't know if you know anything much about the shepherd's rod, friend, but it is not the truth of God. It's not where we are to be today. And so I just want to encourage you that we need to come together. We need to come together and unify, as we're told in the testimony of Jesus, to unify on a solid scriptural basis. And our pioneers studied the Word of God. They came to these conclusions. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that they had all the truth. Proverbs 4:18 says that the light shineth more and more into brighter and brighter into the perfect day. We understand that. We understand that we will learn depths and portions of the plan of salvation throughout eternity. We'll never exhaust it. So no, we're not saying knowledge is ended. But what we are saying is that the fundamental truths that we've been given are the truths that we need to enter into the kingdom of God. And we need to try to expand on those truths, yes, to take them to a higher, as Ellen White says, to take them to a higher place than hitherto they've been given. But new truth never contradicts old truth. New truth will never contradict old truth. And so I want to encourage you to pray about being a part of God's people in a unified and organized way so that we can complete this last link in the chain of prophecy.